What's up, everybody? Etchy here from Dead Draw Gaming, bringing you a free Lugia VSTAR Masterclass. I originally wanted to do just a normal deck profile video where I just go through a few lists, a few key card inclusions, tech cards, and then just go into some gameplay. But I ended up typing more and more, so I was like, I might as well just do a full-blown Masterclass type video for everyone to hopefully learn from. There's a lot to go over with Lugia, so let's get into it. So quick intro for me, if you just clicked onto this, if this is your first Dead Draw Gaming channel video. My name is Etchy, as I mentioned earlier. I started playing in 2022, basically right before Silver Tempest and Lugia VSTAR came out. Most recently, I got Day 2 with Lugia at NAIC 2024. I only played Lugia to NAIC because of a YouTube comment on one of our videos saying I can't play Lugia because I was sequencing incorrectly in the video. And I just took that as an opportunity to just lock in and really learn the deck and really focus on it, and I did pretty well with it at NAIC. And as a result, I have played way too much Lugia since NAIC, both on and off stream. I've learned a lot about it, gone through a bunch of different versions and variations, so we'll be giving y'all that insight that I've learned today. So we'll be going over why you want to play Lugia in Twilight Masquerade, what makes it good. I will be going over the key Pokemon cards, tech cards, a few of my favorite lists right now, especially one that I have called The Sauce. I really like the list a lot. We'll get into that. We'll go over matchup notes on a bunch of the key matchups right now in the format. I'll give some general sequencing tips, and then we'll also cover Lugia in Shrouded Fable format because that format is fast approaching and there are some changes that you need to be aware of if you're going to play Lugia in that format. So, why Lugia? Well, first of all, Legacy Energy is completely busted and broken, not only acting as a rainbow energy, but also giving you potential to just ruin your opponent's prize map is just so good and puts a lot of pressure on your opponent to either find an answer to it, like Enhanced Hammer or Temple Sinnoh, or just going around it if possible. And a lot of times you put in the Legacy on a Pokemon that they need to deal with, like Iron Hands EX, and it causes a lot of problems for them. So really strong card that makes the deck so much more powerful in this format and going forward, and just a key part to why it makes it Lugia so good. It's also extremely flexible, and it's really easy to adjust your build or your tech choices depending on your expected meta. So you can have a Lugia list that can deal with basically any of the top lists. Just depends on how you want to tech for it. So if you know your local meta really well, you can make a Lugia list that just has no problem into 90% of it and be totally fine. You can also have strong matchups into the top decks in the format right now. So like Gardevoir, Lost Box can handle them pretty consistently. And then you can tech for like Charizard or Dragapult if you're more worried about those and handle those no problem. So really flexible, really strong deck that can just handle whatever people throw at you. It's also very easy to learn and very straightforward. This is my favorite part of the deck. It's really easy to point out and help people improve with the deck because it's not like Lost Box where sometimes a decision you make 5 turns earlier causes you to lose the game and you just don't realize it in the moment, and it was very hard for you to think through all the possible scenarios that could have led to the moment where it did lose you the game. But that doesn't really happen in Lugia. It's much more linear, much more straightforward, very easy to improve and learn the deck. You also have no issues with time, really. I think I tied 1 round at NAIC, and it's because just some really awkward and really long games in a matchup that I wasn't comfortable with. So it's pretty hard to tie in general with the deck, which is a huge upside compared to some of the other decks in the format. In best of 1, it doesn't really matter because most best of 1 games are finishing in 30 minutes anyway, but with this deck, you'll for sure have no problem with finishing those games. Going into the key cards here, I'm going to start with Archeops. With all these, I'm not going to cover everything in super detail. I'm kind of just going to go over the more niche parts of a card, or more so the unique situations that can come up if you use this card that you might not think about initially. First thing with this is that it's one of your only single prize attackers in the deck. If you're playing Cinchinos, you have those as well, but other than that, this is basically it. It's not bad for a single prize attacker. The big downside, obviously, is you don't really want your Archeops to get knocked out ever. So if you're putting in the active, you should be only doing that as either a last resort or you're trying to force your opponent to take a single prize. And you better make sure that you have a contingency for this Archeops getting knocked out, and then that you can still set up enough attackers to win the game. One of the trickiest parts of Lugia is just figuring out what to do with your extra primal turbos. Typically, this is using the extra primal turbos to attach a gift or a mist to Archeops, or mist to Pokemon in general. You can use it to set up future Weird Year V plays. We'll go into that in more detail later. Another big use of extra primal turbos is just priming a pivot Pokemon, What I mean by that is Archeops has 1 retreat cost. So if you have an extra Primal Turbo to use, you can Primal Turbo an energy onto your Archeops, and then the next turn, when your active gets knocked out, you promote the Archeops into the active, and then you can retreat freely, and that way you have both your Primal Turbos to use on whatever Pokemon you actually want to attack with that turn. So yeah, it's a pretty common pivot as a result because of it being the 1 retreat. A lot of times you can just kind of throw it up if you have nothing better to promote in the active before you kind of figure out your turn. And figure out what to do with extra Primal Turbos is honestly like one of the trickier things with the card. And usually if I'm like slowing down in a game to like think through things really thoroughly, it's usually because of this. Because you're trying to think through and trying to maximize your odds of, not losing later in the game. And usually it comes down to being smart with what you do with these extra Primal Turbos. Obviously, a lot of the times you're kind of using them always to just like quickly power up attackers, but every once in a while you get an extra one. You really want to use those as efficiently as possible because you never know how many more you have left in the game, because your opponent could always just knock out one of your Archeops, could knock out one of your other Pokemon and kind of ruin your plans for what you were trying to set up. So really try to think through all of your options with like what happens if you attach to what Pokemon at any point in the game and what your opponent might do in response. And then the other thing to note with this is just some games you got to go with 1. It's totally fine. It happens. Obviously, you would like to go double Archeops basically every game. But sometimes, outside of scenarios where you obviously just kind of win the game with a single Archeops like you donk or something, there are times where it is worth it to just YOLO and go for it. There was a game at NAIC where I had a pretty horrible start and my opponent was kind of getting into their actions as a Gardevoir EX player. And my hand was kind of bad, but I could have at least summoning starred for a single Archeops and get an Iron Hands amp out. But the problem is I had no follow-up to that play, like literally at all, unless I got good cards off prizes. And obviously in that scenario, it's very easy for your opponent to just knock out the Archeops and then you're just kind of stuck there, right? I felt like it was just the best action I had at that point because I just had no other option really to attack unless I just did Read the Wind. So I ended up going for it. I amped, and I basically just said, all right, my opponent either has it or doesn't, and my opponent did not have it, and I won the game. So sometimes single Archeops is okay. Kind of takes experience to really figure out when it is correct and when it's not correct to do so, but definitely experiment with single chops every once in a while and make sure you kind of have a good understanding of when you can and cannot go for it, or more importantly, when you should risk it and when you shouldn't risk it. Lumineon V, broken card. When you play it from your hand onto your bench, you can search for a supporter card, put it in your hand, do whatever you want with it. Remember that if Jacques is in the deck, that means Lumineon V plus an Ultra Ball equals 2 chops in the discard. This also means that 2 Ultra Balls straight up is 2 chops in the discard, as long as you have enough things to discard in your hands to actually execute that. So just keep those in mind. They're kind of little shortcuts. Jacques is really, really good in this deck. Big fan of it. It's got a serviceable attack, honestly, that you'll typically use more so in like the slower matchups like Lost Box and Gardevoir. Especially against Gardevoir, it's really easy for them to knock out your Lumineon, so being able to Aqua Return on a turn where you can't do anything better, where you can't take 2 prizes, is not bad. Totally fine to do. It's another really good pivot because it has 1 retreat cost as well, so you can, if you have an extra Primal Turbo, you can attach a gift onto it. That way, if they try to knock it out, you get a bunch of cards, and if they don't knock it out, then you get your free pivot at least. And it's also usually not really a liability, surprisingly. Well, I'll talk about when you really should not bench it and when you should really try to avoid to bench it, but a lot of times your games are going to go so fast that it doesn't even matter that you have Lumineon V on bench, especially because a lot of times you're just going to be Iron Handsing, and they need to deal with the Iron Hands, otherwise they lose the game. So they can't really afford to just go around it and KO Lumineon that often. Another nice thing to mention with Lumineon V is that if you're playing Messagoza and you have it down on the board and your opponent hand disrupts you with Unfair Stamp, Roxanne, Iono, whatever, most of the time they actually don't bop your stadiums. So Messagoza plus Lumineon actually equals hand disruption protection, because at least you have now a 50% chance to get a Lumineon into your hand and then get a support and do whatever you actually wanted to do that turn. Maybe just play a research, maybe get Jacques to guarantee that you have your play for the next turn, whatever it may be. One of the nice benefits of Messagoza for sure. Next up is Iron Hands EX. This card is also broken. I want to point out that you can in fact arm press with certain lists if you're playing the extra basic lightning energy. It's very easy to arm press as long as you can search out your earthen vessel. You can use that, get the extra lightning on there, allowing you to hit for up to 320 to lightning weak Pokemon. So the big thing where that's important is like Pidgeot EX, Lugia VSTAR. Those are really the 2 main ones. I guess Palkia VSTAR as well if you ever run into that. It's also important to note that 1 Archeops plus manual attach does equal an amp you very much. All you do is attach some energy and then you can Archeops, Primal Turbo for Legacy and double Turbo energy, and that's enough. So as long as you can get the Iron Hands into the active or it's already in the active, you only need one Archeops for that. So, and assuming that 100 damage amp is also fine, you can do that. So this is another scenario where sometimes it makes sense to go for single Archeops because it's really easy to go for this play. You also have to be really careful about benching it, because what's going to happen a lot of the time is you're going to have it in your hand and you're going to have research, and you're going to need to play the research or the Carmine. And you're going to be like, well, I don't want to lose this Iron Hands, but if I bench it, it's kind of awkward to bench because my opponent can, you know, gust it, trap it, be kind of annoying about it. So really be careful about scenarios where you do that. Obviously, if you know that you want to Iron Hands turn 2, then just go ahead and bench it and the research and then hope it all works out. But not the end of the world. Just make sure that you're not just benching it just because you're going to lose it. Think of the repercussions of benching it, because it can be pretty detrimental to you at times. Also want to point out that this card has no ability on it. So this, the Lugia V and the Cinchinos all don't have abilities. So if you're dealing with Frostlass decks or anything with Cornerstone Ogerpon, those are your answers to it. And yeah, I just want to point out, if there is no Drifloon, Guardy will usually do something like Monkey Dory, some damage onto the Iron Hands, attack for 190 with Gardevoir EX, and then use Monkey Dory the next turn to get around things like Legacy and Gift Energy. There are a lot of ways that Gardevoir can get around those beyond just, you know, E-Hammer and Temple. They can do stuff like that. So just be aware of that stuff. Don't expect to always force them down the path that you want them to go down. And we will kind of go into how you can play around this strategy later. Blood Moon Ursaluna EX, also broken. Awesome card. Huge buff to the deck that we got this format. It's a great bailout for late game when you've researched 5 of your energies. On turn 1, you can still attack with this thing, no problem at the end of the game. If your opponent takes 5 prizes, you attack for free. 4 prizes, attack for 1 energy, etc., etc. Jet energies can fix the downside on it. 260 HP is really annoying for a lot of decks. And it is really your key card against Raging Bolt, Iron Hands, some Miraidon as well. Really try not to throw away this guy, especially in those matchups, because this guy's awesome. And now we'll go into some tech cards. So Iron Bundle, one of my favorite tech cards. It is a strong response to a singular Iron Thorns, not multiple. If you're playing Quad Thorns, this will not save you. Also really good against Fluttermane, allowing you to, maybe you have like a Lugia VSTAR inactive and your opponent has a Fluttermane. You can Iron Bundle to move the Fluttermane and actually use your Summoning Star ability. But it is important to note that this does not get around Klefki. Klefki blocks the Hyper Blower ability, so do not try to do this to stop a Klefki. It will not work. If you're getting Klefki'd, hope you have Gust. Klefki is really annoying to deal with because it also shuts down your Minions. That's really the weakest part of Iron Bundle, is that you can't deal with that. But other than that, this card's awesome. Synergizes really well with Iron Hands because a lot of times you're going to have like a meaty 2-prizer in the active, like Charizard EX or Dragapult or something. And then you can just Iron Bundle and they are forced to send up a weak single prizer and you can just amp them, no problem. And I also want to point out this attack is pretty usable, honestly. Now, generally you want to use your Legacy energy to make one of your 2 prizes a 1-prizer, especially in something against something like Regidrago. But it is pretty decent in a matchup like Regidrago because it sets up damage for a Lugia knockout or Ursaluna or whatever knockout later, and it also prevents them from attacking. So if they don't have a good response, maybe they already Legacy started and discarded like Penny Switch, then it's definitely a really strong option to buy yourself a turn, buy yourself some time. Something you should definitely consider if you are in a weird position against a deck like Regidrago. Now, the tech card Drapion V was played in the Alex Szymanski list, which we'll talk more about later. At NAIC, it is really good if you're hitting a lot of Gardevoirs because you just do 2 double turbos on this and you get a KO on Gardevoir EX. Not particularly useful outside of that, unfortunately, right now. There's not a lot of things that are weak to dark, so I would only really tech this in if you're planning on hitting a lot of Gardevoirs. You can still have a solid Gardevoir matchup without playing this, especially in like a best-of-1 environment. You really don't need this, but if you want to make sure you actually always like have a really strong Gardevoir matchup, you can tech this in. I would also not worry about teching this into a Cinchino list. We'll go into 2 different kind of builds later, but Cinchinos do the same thing. Obviously with more energy and a little bit more work, but they're close enough that I wouldn't bother putting this into a Cinchino list. Weirder V, one of my favorite cards. It is a one-shot alternative to Cinchinos. Psy Shield Bash attack does 40 damage for each energy attached to this Pokemon. That does mean that double turbos count as 2 energy, but they do the minus 20, so double turbos are 60 damage. Other energies are 40. That does include basic energies as well, so if you're playing the basic lightning, basic water, whatever, you can slap those on there as well, no problem. Legacy on a Weirder is super strong because it applies a ton of pressure. So you got this thing that can swing for like 400 damage in the active with a Legacy on it, and your opponent's going to feel a tremendous amount of pressure to actually knock it out. And those are the situations where Legacy is at its strongest, because when they're forced to go through that Legacy, you're ruining their prize map most of the time and putting yourself in a really strong position. Downside, obviously, to Weird Ear is that you're using way more energy than Cinccino to do similar amounts of damage. Cinccino is 70 damage per card. Size Shield is 40 per energy, way different. But the upside is that it takes up way less space than Cinccino does in your deck list, and also you can just slap it down and attack with it immediately. You don't have to evolve into it the way you do with Cinccino, so some ups and some downs, but it is a very, very powerful and very strong card. Speaking of Cinccino, Cinccino is a really strong option because it offers more solid matchups to anything that has like big, beefy two prizers. That would be Charizard, Dragapult, Regidrago as well, especially if they do like Rolling Iron or something. It gives you a much more solid option to just knock those big guys out and just worry about less stuff. You just have much more flexible game plans against those types of decks. So if you're thinking you're going to hit a lot of those decks specifically in your local meta, definitely play the Cinccino version, or at least strongly consider it. Downside, like I said, it takes up a lot of space. You can go like 1-1, but you have to build your deck very specifically. When I say 1-1, I mean 1 Minccino, 1 Cinccino. You can look at Liam Halliburton's list from NAIC if you want an example of that. But yeah, against Zard and Pult, you just need 5 energy to KO the EX. One of those can be a double turbo. You want to pre-attach some energy because you basically need to ensure that if your opponent just decides to KO an Archeops the next turn, which again, very common game plan against or from the Zard opponent into you, is you want to make sure that you still have enough to KO with your Cinccino if they go for that Gust option. So usually that means doing a Primal Turbo as soon as you put down like a Minccino and then slapping 2 energy on it. And then the next turn, if they do KO the Archeops, you're still fine. So just keep that in mind if you are going down this route and you are playing against something like Dragapult or Charizard. Another tech card here, Fluttermane, is the strongest response to Iron Thorns EX because it actually lets you beat Quad Thorns. Yay! Normal ability shutdown stuff. It's surprisingly not really that useful into Lost Box. This is something that surprised me when I was first doing a lot of Lugia testing going into NAIC because they all just play bundle. They all play like 4 Super Rods. They're just going to bundle away the Fluttermane, and you don't have like double Fluttermane or Klefki Fluttermane to keep the lock going. And the extra 2 damage counters from Hexcrow really do nothing, like, at all, because you're really going to be one-shotting basically everything in the deck anyway, so don't play it for Lost Box reasons. Play it for other reasons. You can also randomly shut down stuff like Legacy Star, Summoning Star, Psychic Embrace, Refinement, yada, yada, yada. That's actually, like, the best use case for it normally. And the other, like, upside of it is just an easy attacker to use that is a one-prizer. Sometimes it's just nice to have a one-prizer around for trying to disrupt your opponent's prize maps. So that's really the other main use for it, but other than that, it's not super necessary. And for our last tech card, we have Wellspring Ogerpon. This is one of my favorite cards, honestly. I love this card so much in this format, especially in a best-of-1 scenario, like your League Cups and League Challenges, where your opponents are not expecting it. Because one, a lot of people just don't respect the Ogerpon, and even if they aren't sure if you're playing it, it still applies a lot of pressure for them to try to bench Manaphy and waste a bench slot against you. But a lot of times they just can't do that. And then you just torrential pump and you win the game. It's also really easy to torrential pump with single Archeops, so if you can just win the game straight up, like knocking out your opponent's only Curlias with it, then go for it. And then we have Sob, which is your first attack, preventing your opponent's defending Pokemon from retreating. Honestly creates win conditions out of nowhere. There's so many games where I'm just playing the game and I would normally scoop 9 times out of 10 in a scenario that I'm in, but I'm like, oh wait, I could Sob in this. If I can force this and this to happen, I can Sob here and then create a win condition basically out of thin air. It's really, really awesome. You can use double turbos to make the damage 0 if you need to keep like a permanent lock going. But otherwise you can keep it as 20 damage to just maybe apply some damage and then finish up something with Iron Hands. That's the other like common line you would go with it. Think about Sob all the time, every turn while you're playing if you have this card in your deck. It's also important to be careful when you use it because, again, you are shuffling in 3 energy after you attack with this. If that's all your energy on board and you're shuffling it back in, and your opponent does an Archeops snipe, that's really bad because you're just down so much energy. So if you're not like instantly getting a really strong position in early game or instantly putting yourself super far ahead by doing it, be very careful and just be prepared for an Archeops snipe. If you can set up more energy on the board with the other Archeops, definitely do that. And then I also want to point out that I don't like this card as much next format, unfortunately. There's a card that kind of surpasses it, and we'll talk more about that later. All right, getting into the list here. First up, we have what I call just a standard Cinccino list, 3-2 Minccino Cinccino line, 2 of the 70 HPs, 1 of the 60 HP, just to give you better chances into the Regidragos and Dragapults of the world. Has the 4 Lugia Vs, which I think is essential. I think it's a staple. I will never go below 4 Lugia Vs ever again. It is your best starter. It is a card you always want to play turn 1, so no reason to not play 4. 2 Lumineon V is going to be a staple on all my lists as well. I think it's just too powerful to not have 2 of them. And then the Fluttermane is the other tech inclusion in this list. Normally you're choosing between Iron Bundle and Fluttermane in a lot of these lists, so I chose the Fluttermane in this list because this deck isn't built around just trying to spam Amphi very much as possible. We're just going to be going through our opponent's active Pokemon most of the time, so I felt like the Fluttermane was just a more logical tech inclusion because it just shuts down different stuff that might be more relevant and gives you kind of more outs against more things. But on that very standard stuff, you're going to see very similar supporter splits and item splits throughout all of my lists here. And I'll go into some more detailed explanation on some other parts of my general Lugia deck builds as we go through them. All right, getting into the more fun list now. I have this one, and I call it I Can't Afford 2 Iron Hands, or I really like Wellspring Ogerpon EX. So this list, very similar to the Alex Szymanski build that I mentioned earlier, and basically just gives you the flexibility to do either Iron Hands or Wellspring Ogerpon. One of the big inclusions in this list and one of the changes is swapping out the Serena for the Irida. You're going to see Serena not be in any of my other lists because most of the time when you're using Serena, it's really just to discard 2 Archeops. That's really the biggest use of it. A lot of times you're not even drawing cards with it because you already have too many cards in hand. You're just using it to discard the Archeops. Irida does the same thing because you can just Irida for Ultra Ball. But more importantly, you can Irida for Earthen Vessel, which is really, really huge and just helps further increase your odds of turn 2 Ogerpon or Iron Hands. Additionally, you also get a water Pokemon with Irida, so you can do things like Irida for Ogerpon and Earthen Vessel, and the odds of you getting turn 2 Ogerpon just skyrocket all the way up. Also makes it easier to get Iron Hands off, because if you need to go around the active, you can grab Iron Bundle with the same Irida and get around the active Pokemon. You can even grab Lumineon V with it, which is kind of the default choice if you don't know what else to grab. Gives you an out for a supporter for the next turn. Big fan of Irida, and I'll go into the other supporter I'm a big fan of in that slot in a bit. We're seeing the Jamming Tower now, which I'll talk a little bit more as we go through the matchups of why it's such a strong card. But it's really awesome, really powerful, has no downside to you whatsoever if you're playing a build like this. This one's able to also squeeze in 3 Great Balls, which I'm a big fan of. And yeah, just being able to item search for Earthen Vessel makes it so much easier to get these combos off, those turn 2 combos that really make or break the game a lot of the time. All right, getting into now my second favorite list, which is the Streamlined Szymanski list, which is, yeah, as the title says, literally just a streamlined version of that list. So cutting the Drapion, cutting the Thornton because you're just not using it that often in enough games, and replacing the Serena with the Irida as well here. Even though you're not playing the Ogerpon, I still really, really like having the item search to get the Earthen Vessel because it just makes you, again, so much more likely at the turn 2 Iron Hands. We are playing the 2 Iron Hands in this list as well. And even though you don't have the Ogerpon, you're still able to get the water Pokemon. You're still able to get Iron Bundle and Lumineon, which just further enable you. Iron Bundle, again, just helping you enable those meaty turn 2 hands attacks. Does have the 1 Jamming Tower, can also afford to fit the 3 Great Balls. Really, really consistent in best of 1. Definitely recommend this version if you just don't know what to play. This is kind of my baseline build that I go back to if I'm not sure what to expect in the meta, or what if I just want to prioritize consistency over everything, this is what I would play. And then finally, we come to the sauce. So this is the list I've been playing the most lately. It is very similar to that last list. However, you're going to notice a card in here called Arven. And more importantly, you're going to notice a card in here called Future Booster Energy Capsule. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in the next slide. But other than that, the rest of it is very standard. I play 2 Messagoza instead of the Jamming Tower because you don't want to Jamming Tower your own Future Booster. And also, you cut a Great Ball for the Future Booster. So you need a little bit more consistency, especially in best of 1. So the Messagoza helps kind of fill that gap. And then everything else is, again, very normal, very standard stuff. This is the list I like the most, that I have the most fun playing, and that I've had the most success with. So why Future Booster? This card lets you do 140 damage with your Amphi Very Much when you attach it to your Iron Hands EX, and that is really, really good. One of your worst matchups as Lugia is the Ancient Box matchup, and this just fixes it. Not fully always, because if they just like instantly kill your Iron Hands, it's kind of bad, but that's pretty hard for them to do. If you get a turn 2 Iron Hands with the Future Booster, you're probably just winning the game. And sometimes the deck just kind of falls apart on itself. So this is usually enough to give you a strong enough push in the matchup to make it a relatively consistent win for you. Also gives you a huge edge in the mirror, and also sometimes against Zard or anything that plays Pidgeot, because now, since you do 140 damage with your amps, when your opponent's weak to lightning, does 280. So Really, really huge in the mirror. Can mean that like even if you go second and have kind of a slow start, you can just amp a Lugia for 3 and then amp Lumineon for 3 and you win the game. Really, really powerful. It also turns your Iron Hands into a real pivot, which is amazing. You have no free retreaters in the deck normally, and now you have one. So pretty cool. Also synergizes with the Weirdeer because let's say, again, talking about the Gardevoir strategy from earlier where they leave your Iron Hands alive for a turn with their Gardevoir EX inactive, what you can do is attach the Future Booster Energy Capsule, retreat into a Weirdeer, move all the energy and the Legacy energy off of the Iron Hands into the Weirdeer, and then KO the Gardevoir, and suddenly your opponent's in a tough situation once again. It kind of acts like a 5th jet in your deck, which is really good. You always want more jets. Jets are awesome. And then the other thing the card lets you do is that you are allowed to use double turbo energies in scenarios you normally couldn't. So say you're trying to amp a Lugia V, which has 220 HP. You can't do a 100 damage amp because you won't knock it out. But with Future Booster, you hit for 120 again, so you knock that out because you do 240 total. So in situations where you really want to use a DTE because you want to use your other Archeops to do something else, this is a great time to do it. Or maybe you're just doing single Archeops, another situation where, you know, you just don't have enough energy to go around. This can kind of fix the math for you, and it's awesome. Some miscellaneous kind of deck building notes for Lugia. These are just kind of my thoughts on all the games I played with all these different variations and different versions of the list and different versions of Lugia that I've messed around with over the last couple months. In this format in particular, you really need a minimum of 2 stadiums. If you're expecting Blocklax, you can play 3 as well. You can play 3 jamming towers if you feel like your consistency is good enough. If you really want to have a solid time into those matchups, but definitely wouldn't go below 2. Next format, you can maybe justify going down to 1. It really just depends on how the format shakes out. It's still really early to say, but you can mess around with 1 stadium probably initially and see how other decks are respecting or not respecting Lugia. Messagoza and Jamming Tower are by far the best stadiums. I wouldn't play any other stadium at all in the list. Messagoza if you want more consistency, Jamming Tower if you want kind of better odds into certain matchups. Again, we'll kind of go over those in the matchups as we go through them. I would always play between 16 and 17 energy. Always play 4 gifts. You only need 4 DTE if you're playing Weirdeer. Otherwise, you go down to 3. Also, if you're playing Drapion, you probably want to play 4 DTE as well, so keep that in mind. Feel free to swap the second Carmine for a 3rd research if you really want to. I would not go above 2 Carmine. I used to be a 2 Carmine hater, but I do like having just higher odds of just having it in my hand turn 1, but any more than that is really not important. It also means that you're way less likely to prize both of them. In the rare situation where you actually Lumineon for Carmine turn 1, you're always going to get it. It's going to be fine. And lastly, just go first blind. All the lists I've given you today are very consistent, very strong, so should have no problem with getting something reasonable out turn 2 most of the time. So just go first. Go first and be aware of what your opponent can do on turn 2. All right, going into the matchups, Gardevoir EX is first. Drapion V does make this matchup much less stressful, especially if you have a way to recycle it. It's like a no-brainer, but it's not really worth tanking for, in my opinion. Your Gardevoir matchup's solid enough if you know how to play the matchup and you're experienced with it and you have the heavy turbo Iron Hands. Not really worth it, in my opinion, especially in like best of 1 scenarios. But if you think you're going to hit like 80% Gardevoirs, then go ahead and throw it in. It is still very strong in the matchup. Turn 2 Iron Hands just applies a ton of pressure. If you amp twice in a row, you basically just win the game. So you are pretty much always just trying to go for the turn 2 Iron Hands, or if you are playing the Ogerpon, turn 2 Ogerpon if it shuts them out of the game hard enough. Other thing to know is that the way the matchup plays is pretty different depending on if they have Drifloon and Charm or not. So try to like practice against both variants to get a good feel for like the lines they go through, because they're a little bit different. But sometimes what happens is like when they are doing Drifloon and Charm, they can't do the Drifloon play they want to, so they just do the strategies of the other list. So sometimes you just kind of get enough experience from playing one of them. But either way, just be aware of that. Obviously, your jamming towers do way less if your opponents aren't using Drifloon Charms. So the only thing you're really using the jamming tower for is like Luxurious Cape. So just to kind of go through an example line and strategy for the matchup, you can do an Iron Hands for 2 prizes. Your opponent does the Gardevoir Monkey Dory thing, so you have a 220 damage Iron Hands in your active. You can switch out to Weirdeer, move all the energy off it, move that Legacy energy onto the Weirdeer as well, and then knock out their Gardevoir EX, and then they're forced to go around your Weirdeer, which immediately results in another knockout for you, and is really dangerous because if you just have Gust in hand, then you can just knock out their Gardevoir on the bench with that Weirdeer, and then the game's over. Or they're forced to just go through the Weirdeer. They can't do the cute Monkey Dory thing because they kind of need to knock it out immediately. So if you do that, and they go through it, their prize map is ruined, and you are probably just going to win the game. You have plenty of time from that point. You have 2 turns at that point to just take prizes with whatever you want. Just be really aware of Turo in this matchup. They can always Turo and heal the Guardies. They literally always have it. You should assume your opponent just always has Turo and Counter Catcher in hand because they just always do. Just always keep those possibilities in mind. Some other notes. Attacking with Lugia is fine in the matchup if you don't get a strong turn 1 or turn 2. Not the end of the world. You can always make up prizes later with Iron Hands, and sometimes your opponent doesn't have the perfect turns that it feels like they do a lot of the time. Read the Wind is usable more often than you think as well. You can play things a little bit slower every once in a while, depending on their starts. If you have extra Primal Turbos and you're not sure what to do with them, just use them to attach a single gift to an Archeops. Again, doubles as a pivot and also punishes them if they try to gust up and attack it later. And then just pay very close attention to prizes and, again, expect Counter Catcher, expect Turo, all the fun tricks that they can do, or just expect them every turn. And really pay attention also to Monkey Dory attaches. Remember that they can't just get 2 Monkey Dories down at the same time and then do double Monkey Dory. They have to play within their limitations. They can only do 1 attach per turn of that darkness energy, so they can only put down 2. Also, if they just don't have room to bench 1, and you don't take a knockout, then it forces weird situations there as well. So just keep all that stuff in mind and just really try to think through their shoes and what they're able to do at any point in time. It's a tricky matchup, but usually it plays out very simply, and it kind of comes down to if you have it, you got it, and if you don't, you don't, you know? That's how a lot of these matchups tend to boil down to. Chien-Pao, don't have a lot to say about it. It's a very straightforward matchup. Try to go 2-2-2 while forcing them through a Legacy energy, especially when you go second. If you're going first, the Legacy basically doesn't matter. You're just trying to go 2-2-2. The earlier you Legacy, the better. And when I say that, I mean like your first attack being a Legacy V-Star, a Lugia V-Star with a Legacy on it, knocking out a Chien-Pao, something like that. Because it forces them to do something about it, and if they're forced to go through Legacy, their prize map's ruined, and you just win the game. If they're going to try to get around the Legacy as much as possible, so try to avoid benching Lumineon for as long as possible. You can Legacy onto it to prevent them from taking a 3-prize knockout with an Amp, and it's usually fine if you're going first, especially, because then they can't randomly come back into the game. So definitely consider the option when you don't go first, because they can fix some weird things. Normally what will happen is they can potentially fix the Legacy issue. So let's say they go through Lugia VSTAR for 1 prize instead of 2. They can just amp a Lumineon for 3 prizes later and then fix their prize map, and suddenly they still win in 3 attacks. So yeah, very simple, very straightforward matchup. Just try to think about, you know, how to make, just think about how to make sure that they can't cheat a turn at any point in time. Lost Box, very simple strategy. You're just going to spam Iron Hands as much as possible, or Ogerpon if you have that as well. Use your Weird Ear to respond to Ursaluna. You can respond in 1 turn if you have a way to attach to it, like a Jet in hand in particular, or if you're able to just immediately promote it into active when it gets knocked out, when your, say, your Iron Hands gets knocked out. You just need 3 double turbos and 2 other energies, gets you to 260 damage. So you can charge it up in 1 turn, and that handles the Ursaluna no problem. Otherwise, if you're playing Cinchinos, you can just deal with it the normal way, totally fine. Similar to a lot of other decks that can spread damage, you want to hold on to your mist for as long as possible. Unless you play 4, then at that point, just spread them as much as you want on anything that you're potentially worried about. Get those mists on those Archeops earlier, if possible. You also want to avoid benching Lumineon early, in particularly. If you bench it early, you open up weird, like, 3-3 prize maps or 3-2-1 prize maps for them. So the later you bench it, the better. And again, if you're, let's say you're able to get your Iron Hands attacks off with your Lightning energies instead of your Legacy, you can Legacy use the Lumineon. You can also just immediately attack with the Lumineon as soon as you put it down with that Aqua return, just to get it out of there. So remember to keep that option open. And then use Iron Bundle to deal with the Thorns or Fluttermane, of course. But primarily, again, all these matchups we're talking about, by the way, are typically through the perspective of that sauce list. So Bundle will be how you deal with singular Thorns. They don't play 2 Thorns. So just make sure you have an out to that before you do your Summoning Star turn, if possible. Raging Bolt. You need to bench 2 Lugias turn 1. You need to bench 2 Lugias turn 1. Repeat it with me. It's super important. It's very, very easy for them to get a Lugia V knockout on their first turn. So just bench 2 of them, and you will probably be fine. You're trying to go for a 2-2-2 prize map while forcing them to take a 1 prizer with Legacy. Again, if they miss that first knockout, then you don't really have to worry about it. You just go 2-2-2. You don't really have to think that hard. Otherwise, if they do take that first knockout, you need to cheat a turn back. The only way to do that is with a Legacy on your 1 prizer, or by using Cinchinos if you're playing Cinchinos. So typically you want to attach Legacy to your first attacker. That'll look something like Lugia V-Star with Legacy to KO a benched Ogerpon. And then your next turn you're KOing a benched Ogerpon or the active Raging Bolt with Ursaluna or Lugia V-Star or Weird Ear, depending on what's in front of you. And then for your last 2 prizes, you can KO Raging Bolt with Ursaluna or Weird Ear. The later you do Ursaluna, the easier it is to get off because, you know, obviously needs less energy as more time goes on. Obviously, Bravery Charms are kind of annoying, but not all the lists play them, and you can just gust around it if needed. The nice thing is they play very little hand disruption, so if you're forcing them through gifts every time they take a knockout, you're usually in a pretty good spot, and you probably just have the gust that you need in hand. Sometimes they'll throw out the Baby Sandy Shocks or the Greninja if they don't have the turn 1 going second knockout. You can use Iron Hands every once in a while just to kind of still take 2 prizes if you're not able to like do something else in Gust. So just remember that that's an option if you really need to. Unfortunately, the Iron Hands isn't that good after that, but if you're taking the first knockout, you're probably just winning anyway. The legacy thing doesn't really matter. So even if your Iron Hand just kind of chills and does nothing the rest of the game, it's still fine. All right, our next matchup is Regidrago VSTAR. Very similar game plan to Raging Bolt. Regidrago is just a more versatile version of Raging Bolt. Sometimes it's more consistent too. Same thing, you want to hold Mist for as long as possible, similar to what you're doing with Lost Box. You're going to do the same thing against Dragapult as well. Just try to hold them until they actually are, you know, 1 Phantom Dive away from knocking out something on the bench. Try to deny those 4 prize knockouts that they can sometimes set up by just using those Mists as late as possible. You can use Bundle or just any kind of Gust to go around the Rolling Iron effect that is on their Regidrago VSTAR if they do decide to Rolling Iron. V-Guard is really good in this matchup. I would definitely play 1 or 2 going into next format, but it's not critical in this format, so don't worry about it now. Your matchup's fine, honestly. It's just more worth it next format because you're going to see way more Regidrago in general, but the matchup basically plays the same either way. I would strongly consider 1, but you don't need it, honestly. Generally, you don't want to deal with an active Regidrago VSTAR like ever until way later in the game because you can only really KO them with your Weird Ear. Again, sometimes you can do the refrigerated stream from Iron Bundle if you're desperate, but typically you just want to keep gusting around the Regidrago VSTAR as much as possible. Again, really easy to do with Iron Bundle, 3 bosses, 2 Luminions, shouldn't have a problem with it. And then similar to Raging Bolt, it's very important to Legacy attach early, so I would do basically the same thing. Legacy on a Lugia, I'd start swinging on the Ogrepons, or even a Regidrago V if you're able to knock out one of those. And then again, same as Raging Bolt, Cinchinos make the matchup way easier. Way simpler. The only problem with this is that they actually have Phantom Dive now, so make sure you use those 70 HP ones. But other than that, pretty straightforward. Next up is Charizard and Dragapult. I'm lumping them together because whether you're doing Charizard DX or Charizard with Dragapult or Dragapult DX, the matchup plays basically the same in all scenarios. If there are Dragapults on the list, just, again, hold on to your Mist for as long as possible. Otherwise, play normally. Doesn't really matter. Dream scenario is you're able to go 2-2-2 on prizes. Usually that means Iron Hands Amp for 2, Lugia, Ursaluna KO on a Rotom or a Luminion, and then Weird Ear KO a Charizard for 2. Sometimes you can do it in like reverse order, where you do like Weird Ear KO and then Ursaluna. The thing is, the way this works is that like by just having an Iron Hands inactive, you're really forcing them through it, and by KOing the Rotom the next turn, they basically just don't have time to just focus on gusting up your Archeops and killing them, which is usually what kills the Weird Ear play. You're just applying so much pressure with your other Pokemon that if they try to gust around and KO your Archeops, they're just going to lose the game. So what'll happen here is, like, if they do try to gust around, say, your Lugia VSTAR to KO an Archeops, you'll still have enough energy on board with a Primal Turbo and, like, a Jet Energy to get the Weird Ear KO. If they are forced to bench a Luminion, it makes taking a 1 prizer early on okay, because then you can just amp Luminion for 3 prizes. Very hard for them to get rid of it, especially with the amount of pressure you're applying. It's very hard for them to just be able to quick search for, like, Turo or something. So, and again, the earlier you're able to snipe that, the better. If you're not pressuring them with an Iron Hands in the active, you should just always assume that they're about to gust KO your Archeops, and just keep that in mind and set up your board appropriately. Try to, again, preemptively Primal Turbo to certain Pokemon, and just make sure you can execute a game plan that actually gets you 6 prizes when they do start gusting your Archeops and doing that. Use Iron Bundle to go around the active Charizard to get either like a Rotom into the active or 1 prize that you can amp. And then Pidgeot KO is extremely good if you can do it. Again, you don't even need the Future Booster to do it, but if you have Future Booster and Boss in hand, you can do Amp for 3 prizes, which is disgusting. But you can also just do an Arm Press with a Lightning Energy, a Legacy, and then whatever else. So if you're able to do that, still very strong, still totally worth it, and it's easily the best 2 prizes you can knock out literally at any point in the game. And also just be prepared for Radiant Charizard coming down later. Totally fine when that does come up. Just, again, you just have to gust around it. Not a big deal. Going into Ancient Box now, again, very tough matchup without the Future Booster, really hard, and kind of relies on them whiffing. If they bench the Greninja, you amp it for free for 2 prizes at some point, and if they don't, and you don't play booster, and they're able to at least get attacks off, you probably just lose the game. Usually they need to play Greninja to just play the game and keep up normally, so you're usually going to see that Greninja down. So having the Greninja down, and if you get 1 amp off on a 140 HP Mon with the Future Booster, you're going to be fine. The thing where it gets weird is if they don't play Greninja, but you only get like 140 HP amp off, it gets kind of dicey, so definitely not guaranteed a strong matchup or anything, but the matchup is way better with that Future Booster. And if you are not going into an early amp, like let's say they Ancient Boostered their active immediately, then you can just use Lugia VSTAR early on and then go into the amps later. It's totally fine. They'll run out of gas eventually, and then you can just try to take 2 prizes with that, and hopefully that'll be your last 2 prizes and you win the game. Again, nice thing with Ancient Boxes, they're probably not hand-swept to you much, so keep that in mind. Miraidon is a very weird matchup. It is not as horrible as you might think it is. The most important thing is that you need to make sure you actually play the game. So again, bench 2 Lugia Vs turn 1. They pretty much always get like turn 2 going first. Charged up Iron Hands and Miraidon and Prime Catcher, they just always get it. It's magic, I don't know, but just expect it. And when it happens, it's fine. It's not the end of the world. You can use Legacy to try to fix your prize map if possible. Again, same thing I was mentioning earlier with the Lumineon. If you bench it early, you can try to Legacy onto it, because you obviously aren't going to need the Iron Hands basically at all in the matchup, so you use Legacy solely to fix prize maps. Ursaluna is your best friend. It's very hard for them to deal with it. They pretty much only have the Raichu V, so if you're able to stun them for a turn with Ursaluna, you're probably fine. Jamming Towers are really good in this matchup because they stop both Bravery Charms and Heavy Batons. So if you're able to stop like Heavy Baton from activating after they turn through like 3 generators, Prime Catcher, and all that stuff turn 1 just to get an attack off, you probably just win the game. Otherwise, you can still like attack something with Ursaluna, like a Charmed Iron Hands. You can attack it with Ursaluna and then on a later turn get the Jamming Tower down, as long as they don't get rid of it with like Collapse or something before that. But otherwise, it's honestly, it's definitely not like a great matchup, I would say, but it's not bad. It's not the end of the world. It is definitely workable, and you can tech harder or softer for it, depending on what you want to do. Blocklax. This matchup's way more annoying than it used to be, because they just realized how bad the matchup was and started slamming 4 Temple of Sinnohs down. If you're playing the Cinccino build, the game plan's really simple. You're going to put all your energy on one Cinccino and just keep jetting it into the active. Something to kind of note is that the 70 HP Minchinos can discard tools, so if they're stuck in the active for whatever reason, you can take advantage of that, just like a DTE, to get rid of the tools. Can be pretty useful. You can discard like Hero's Cape and a handheld fan if they're not expecting it. And then in general, you just want to hold on to your Jets and your Stadiums for dear life and not play them until they're going to get you either a KO or like a really important KO. And then otherwise, you also have more time than you realize a lot of the time. Once you're locked, let's say you have like an Iron Hand stuck in the active and you don't have like a way to get a knockout in hand, don't be afraid to just keep holding until you get that perfect combo of like Iono, Jamming Tower, Jet. Totally fine. They really can't do much to you once you are locked, because obviously Airy and Misfortune Sisters really don't do that much to your deck, because you don't play that many like item cards that matter late in the game. It's really just the Jets. Obviously be aware of Giacomo, so don't over attach energy all over the place. Fill the bench fast. It's really easy to do with the Cinccino build, because you can just throw down a bunch of Minchinos. Really harder if you're playing the Sauce. That's one of the tougher matchups for this list. Things get really awkward, so you have to utilize Lugia VSTAR sometimes to bump Stadiums with its Tempest Dive attack. You also want to make sure your board has some sort of answer for Mimikyu or potentially Cornerstone Ogerpon if you're thinking they might play that. So Archeops can deal with the Mimikyus, and then Iron Hands and Lugia Vs can deal with the Cornerstones. Sometimes single Archeops is fine, so just be aware of how much good single Archeops does for you at any point in time. Double Archeops is just straight up better if you're playing the Sauce, because it's just another thing on the bench that is not awful to have on the bench. Again, those are hard to find in this list. So then my last piece of advice is just be luckier than your opponent. That's what this matchup usually just comes down to. Just be luckier. And definitely practice it a couple times. It's not as awful as it seems. It's just annoying. All right, getting into sequencing general tips. Fortunately, Lugia is a very simple sequencing deck in general. Usually your decisions aren't that hard. Usually your hardest decisions are things like thinking multiple turns ahead for your primal turbos, for your extra ones, and thinking about where you want to put the energy. And those decisions usually get better over time. The more you play the deck, the better you'll get with sensing those out. But there's still some sequencing that you got to think about while you're playing. First thing, the obvious big one that everyone asks is Capturing Aroma or Great Ball. Which do I do first? And generally, if you're looking for a specific Pokemon, you want to play Aroma first, because let's say you get Tails and you get Basic, and that's what you want, you just grab it. If you get Heads, you're thinning out a different Pokemon, so that when you play Great Ball, you're more likely to hit the other Pokemon that you're looking for. And then if you're looking for multiple Pokemon, you want a Great Ball first. Let's say you're looking for both Lumineon and Iron Hands in a given turn. You can Great Ball first to just maximize your odds of hitting both those things, and then go for the Aroma after that. Be very mindful of Iono and where cards are in the deck before making any decisions. So the coolest part of Lugia is that you can shuffle your deck basically whenever you want, thanks to Primal Turbo. But you need to be aware of which cards just got Iono to the bottom, whether or not you want those cards in your hand for following turns, whether or not you want those cards to potentially show up in your next Great Ball, yada, yada, yada. A lot of things to consider. Again, not actually that complicated because there's only so many effects that you're going to have in this deck at any point in time to like look through your deck. So if you just think through it all, you probably have enough time during your turn to actually like weigh the odds for what is correct. But just remember that you can always shuffle a deck really easily. Also, Messagoza allows you to shuffle the deck. Usually you want to activate Messagoza earlier in your sequence rather than later, just to better inform decisions, because if you just Messagoza first, you're like, oh, okay, I got one of the pieces I need, and now I can play things in this different order instead. That is more likely to hit what I need. Be mindful of what you're revealing before you take actions. This is almost entirely referring to Iron Bundle. So specifically, if you're doing a sequence where you're like, okay, I want an Iron Bundle and then Iron Hands, single prizer, blah, blah, blah. Just bundle first early in the sequence, even if you know you're going to Ultra Ball for your Iron Hands and then attach to it and stuff. There's no reason to Iron Hands first and attach energy to it, because you're just giving your opponent more information about what to send up with the bundle than what they promote might actually change. So other thing is to please do weirder math before you commit to a weirder play. Again, sounds dumb, sounds obvious. Just do it. Just really think through it. Double check your work. You have time. It's really simple arithmetic. You got this. I believe in you. And then when deciding whether to draw or Primal Turbo first, when I say draw, I mean like preventing Iono or Professor's Research, consider the downsides of drawing into the energies you want off Primal Turbo, because there will be times where it's like, okay, well, if I research, I'm more likely to hit this combo, but if I draw into Legacy Energy from that kills the combo completely, because then I can't Primal Turbo, because I want to research and I want to attach this double turbo in my hand so I don't lose it, and blah, blah, blah. Just really try to think through that kind of downside before you decide if you're going to research or Iono or whatever before you Primal Turbo. And if you're like, okay, I need to hit this combo no matter what, and I need to make sure I have like Legacy Energy attached from Primal Turbo because I already did my attach return, then just Primal Turbo first. And then for our last thing we're going to cover today, we're going to talk about Lugia and Shrouded Fable. I think Lugia and Shrouded Fable is still really good. Kind of the summary of our tabletop testing, if you haven't been watching that on the Dead Draw Gaming channel, is basically it's kind of like a big three format, where right now the best three most popular decks are going to be Regidrago VSTAR, Charizard EX, and Gardevoir EX. That is what I would expect to be top three most popular at Worlds, unless something massive changes in the next couple of weeks. All very, very powerful decks. Gardevoir didn't change that much in this format. Regidrago changes a lot with Kyurem, but doesn't really impact the Lugia matchup. And then Charizard actually adding the Dusknoirs that can just destroy themselves to do 13 damage onto a Pokemon is actually really relevant for Lugia. So the Cinccino build becomes simultaneously more and less valuable in the Shrouded Fable format. It's more valuable because Zard's going to be more popular. Cinccino's give you much more flexibility, much more options against Zard. But they can just Dusknoir and zap a Cinccino off the face of the board. No problem. So it's kind of sketchy. I'm very uncertain if I want to go with Cinccino heavy build or a Iron Hands heavy build, like the Sauce, going to next format. Right now, I'm leaning more towards the Sauce and just hoping the matchup plays well and just kind of focusing on consistency. But it's really tough. It's really tricky to figure it out. I definitely got to test it way more. That's really the biggest thing that's changes, is just Zard has much more options against you, and you have to be really careful. Other thing to note is that Pheasantipity is sick. I love Pheasantipity so much. I've only played a few games in the format with Pheasantipity, and I've attacked with it so many times. Its attack does 100 damage to one of your opponent's Pokemon, so it's just 100 damage bench snipe or in the active if you really want to. And simultaneously is onboard draw, which is something that Lugia has never had and finally has. It's really awesome. Something that came up in the games against Jake, which, again, if you haven't seen those, it's either going to be already on the channel or it'll be up literally the next day from this video. But yeah, like Cruel Arrow onto Lone Pidgey, it can be enough to just like disrupt Zard and win you the game sometimes. So just having that bench snipe option, it pressures them to have Manaphy or second Pidgey down a lot more often. It's really, really awesome. It is a dark type Pokemon, so it can technically hit Gardevoir EX for weakness, which won't really be that relevant. It can also hit Mew EX for weakness, which might be slightly relevant. I don't know. The weakness attacking element of this is not going to be common, but the fact that you can do like an energy and a double turbo and snipe a Pidgey, snipe a Charmander, really, really awesome, really strong. And then lastly, Zard is able to KO Lugias early now. I mentioned earlier that it's pretty safe to go Read the Wind against Charizard, but you cannot do that against new Charizard if they have a Duskull on the bench. Now, if they don't have the Duskull, feel free to just Read the Wind. Totally fine. They can't do anything to you. Unless they play Choice Belt and like Kieran, which they're not going to, at least right now. Especially when they have Duskull in the format, there's no reason to. But when they have a Duskull on the bench, that means the next turn they can just Dusclops, put 5 energies on, first put 5 damage counters on your Lugia V, and then just attack it with a 180 damage Brain Darkness, and you'll be very sad. So just be more wary of that. There's a lot more pressure on you to go 2-2-2 with your prize map cleanly now. A lot sketchier, a lot more. You really just have to hit your beats every turn, which again is easier than it sometimes seems as long as you don't brick. If they bench Lumineon, that makes things a lot easier because you can do things like Cruel Arrow a Pidgey turn 1 or turn 2. Then the next turn you can amp the Lumineon for 3, and then you can take your last 2 prizes however you want. So Lumineon makes things easier as always, but sometimes they don't bench it and then things get awkward. So just the Zard matchup is really the thing that kind of decides if Lugia is going to survive strongly enough next format. I'm obviously going to be working on it a lot, trying to get it to work, trying to fix it, and see how that goes. But yeah, this is just a sample list for Shrouded Fables formats that I've been working on. Again, it looks so similar to the last list. Wow. Less of a need for Future Booster in Shrouded Fable format, so I cut it from this list, went back to the Irida, because there is less Ancient Box probably going around since Zard is going to be so powerful and so strong again. Definitely want to play the Pheasantipede, onboard draw, and the snipe attack is too good. And then everything else is very standard in the list, just 2 Goza, 2 Great Ball. This is my starting point for Shrouded Fable, and I'll evolve the list from here and see how it goes. So that is my Lugia VSTAR Masterclass. I hope you learned something from this very long video. I went into a lot of detail, a lot of different things. If you have any questions about anything, feel free to let me know in the comments. If you have builds or tech cards that you like a lot in Lugia, definitely put that in the comments below. Be sure to like and subscribe if you enjoy this and you want to see more like it. I would love to do a video like this just for free on the Dead Draw Gaming channel. Every format when I've like lasered in on a deck and focused on it. So if you want to see more like this, just let me know. I really enjoyed putting this together, and I hope to see you all in the next video. Bye-bye.